Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Amy Crawford. I'm the Director of Market Strategy for Government Services at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Been with the company for 14 years, based in Atlanta. Awfully glad to be here with you today. We're here to talk about identity assurance in the public sector. So what does that mean, I guess? At the end of the day, I would say our mission, my mission, is to ensure that interaction between a government entity, any government entity, and those that they serve is informed, it's secure, it's timely, and it's accurate. That's it, right? We want to make sure that both parties come away feeling like they got what they wanted in a secure, meaningful, fast manner. So, speaking of getting things from the government, here's a nice kind of depressing slide. I want to bring to your attention the quote in the upper left, which is from GAO. Fraud may be the 6th largest agency that we're funding annually, and that's a lot of money that could be going to better use. It's a little bit disheartening, and I know that I'm preaching to the choir here because we're all in the same boat together, so I won't belabor the point. But I think if anything, the pandemic has taught us many things about ourselves and about others, and it's taught us about identity. I think it's escalated the importance even faster at an exponential pace, understanding identity and approaching how we understand and interact with identity differently. So when we talk about fraud and digital identity assurance in the government space, we always talk about 3 things, right? Means, motive, and opportunity. And the motive, I think that's the easiest to explain. The motive is, it's money, right? Quote unquote, people say free, although it's not free. This money or access to benefits or services to which an individual or a business may not be entitled, right? So that's the opportunity. That's the motive. When we talk about opportunity, unfortunately, we've made the opportunity even easier because we have to serve as a government agency, right? We're government agencies. We have to reach 100% of those that we serve. And in order to do that, we end up opening ourselves up to a lot of risk and exposure that we then in turn have to mitigate when it comes to fraud and criminal activities. So we'll talk about the means in a moment, but as I'd mentioned, I think that the pandemic shined a light on the overall fragility of identity verification and identity assurance, particularly around government agencies and government benefits. And unfortunately now, I think that there's blood in the water, right? Everybody knows about the overwhelming availability. We're still dealing with the small-time fraudster, the small-time crook, but I think that we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we didn't talk about state-sponsored, multinational, international terror events that are affecting our infrastructure, our security posture, and the access to benefits. And unfortunately, that's kind of what we have to deal with if we want to make ourselves as accessible as possible to those we serve. So in an earlier panel discussion, I just wanted to add this. Did anybody attend the Jeremy Grant panel discussion earlier? It was a really great panel discussion. Hopefully you'll be able to see some of the talking points from it. But one of the points that was made that's extremely important is unless there is a formal strategy, unless identity verification and assurance is a priority with the government and there is a formal strategy put in place, it is going to be incumbent upon each individual agency or group of agencies in the event of login.gov to ensure that they have the best solution in place possible, especially for those that are foundational in nature, things that are collaborative, agencies that are collaborating like across login, or even at a state and local level where you have a foundational document like a driver's license that can open up so many other doors across government benefits and government agencies. The burden of responsibility is living with each individual agency to ensure that their posture is as tight as possible. Has anybody here heard of Scattered Spider? Well, George, I know you have. This is George Freeman. He's from Lexis also. He's one of our senior solutions consultants. You'll hear from him in just a moment. Scattered Spider, international group of young individuals between 19 and 23 years old, a hacking group. Very interesting. Actually, one of the ringleaders was just arrested. One of the alleged ringleaders was just recently arrested in Europe. Here's why I'm bringing them up. They perpetrated 2 major hacks. One was against Caesars and one was against MGM Resorts International. And they gained access to both of these multinational billion-dollar corporations by either SIM swapping, MFA fatigue, or somebody even used a customer support line and a LinkedIn profile to pretend to be an employee to gain access to internal systems. So they knew the ways to gain access to the systems. They ended up getting into both, and they took millions and millions of dollars. So why am I talking about casinos? Because we are government agencies. Here's why. If they can get through some of the most secure companies in the world protecting their investments and their infrastructure, you can bet that they're going to get through a government agency. So my recommendation is, at this point, because fraudsters continue to evolve and change over time, and we know that's one thing that we know about fraudsters, is that they are persistent, right? As soon as somebody maybe comes up to a government agency, they interact, and they know that they can't get through, it doesn't mean that they're going to repent and become a good person. They're just going to move on to the next opportunity. So the goal is to not be the next opportunity, plain and simple. So in order to do that, and again, just to reiterate what Jeremy Grant had said earlier, he had mentioned that no single identity solution, no one solution in place, whether it's multi-factor authentication or one-time password or understanding behavioral biometrics or IP addresses, no one solution is going to be that filter that's going to mitigate your risk. So at this point, our recommendation is you need to employ a multi-layered approach, a multifaceted approach, not only so that you can understand the person that you're dealing with is the holder of those credentials, but that those credentials go together, right? So there's two aspects to identity verification and identity assurance. So taking that multi-factored approach, well, George, you're our resident expert. You want to come up and say a couple things? Again, this is George Freeman. He's one of our senior solutions consultants.
Yeah, let me jump in here real quick. First of all, that's highly technical stuff up there. I've got 27 years background in cybersecurity, everything from .com all the way up to cloud security. And what I like to do is share stories. You know, we heard about some of these breaches in the news. I mean, my favorite is California EDD, unemployment. 2021, they reported $2 billion went out the door in fraud. A year later, it was $32 billion. 70% of it went overseas. You know, I don't know if you heard in the news, we acquired a company called BehavioSec. And the guys came over from the EEO, and they were actually joking about that. They said, hey, you know, I have friends calling me that the United States is giving away money all through that pandemic. And it's unfortunate, it's amusing, but it's kind of sad at the same time. And so what we're going to talk about with this workflow is, you know, how do we manage, where's the breakdown actually taking place? And then you've got other issues. Other agencies, there was a certain DMV on the West Coast, you can shall name nameless, they wanted to help their citizens do things like, you know, end user experience. We hear about this a lot. Take care of the user, make it as easy as possible. And they allowed them, but they were going to allow a driver's license holder to change their primary phone number with minimal checks. What could go wrong? Now, this is the same agency. I don't know who's working there, but not 2 years before, we got a call from them in a panic storm. They said over a weekend, 1.5 million license renewals came in, and two things happened. It requested an address change and a second license be issued to the new address. All they did was identity proof the information. Right. They essentially handed out 1.5 million fake IDs over a weekend, and they came to us saying, what do we do? And fortunately, a lot of what you're seeing up here, we're going to talk about this in a minute, is that we do a real-time service. It's through what we call our dynamic decision platform or threat metrics, DDP, BehavioSec, a bunch of these things do it digitally, and it's all real-time. There's no way to like batch and go backward in time. It doesn't work that way. So these are some of the stories I like to share. The third one I want to share is a story we got during lockdown. It was kind of heart-wrenching. A state in the Midwest, shall we say, kind of deep south really, was in a panic. They had 60,000 applications for unemployment assistance within a matter of weeks. They had to shut down their portals. It was that overwhelmed. They essentially ended up rebuilding everything. The problem they had was they couldn't turn anybody away by law. You know, a number of the agencies, I see some heads nodding, you know, that's a reality. They simply cannot reject anyone, so there's no way to just say, oh, you're bad, you're causing fraud, get out of here. So they had to ingest all this. We were able to help them through batch, which means just look up the applications that came in, see if the names, address, phones line up. That's one line of checking. That's getting rid of some of the low-hanging fruit, we call it. But here's the challenge. And I'll give you another story. My dad passed away a few years back. You know, he lived a long life, you know, really strong right to the end. Great way to go. My poor mom was stuck with the mess, you know, typical. If you have any relatives or family members who've been through this, online access to everything had to basically be redone. I mean, I ended up hacking his Mac. It can be done because we had his phone. And we got into that, and I was able to rebuild the accounts. And I'm in there with Social Security Administration and some of her, you know, financials, and I'm thinking to myself, she's right here in the room. They don't know that it's not her. There's nothing in that workflow that checks if it's a human or if it's that person or not. Right. How do you do that? That's really hard. And furthermore, today we've got real challenges with scams. And don't think the threat actors haven't figured this out. It used to be you'd grab George's information, use it on a portal, great, you're good to go. Well, now they've done some basic checks. They can't get away with that as much. The criminals always move to where it's easy. They want to get to the money as easy as possible. We've heard about these campaigns. Has anybody heard about this where they actually call like an account holder and impersonate the bank? Yep. And they say that, you know, there's a cybersecurity incident going on right now, your account's locked, we need to have you transfer all the money out to another safe account. That's what they claim. And then a second person calls them. Sounds super official. And most of the folks impacted are seniors, but not always. There's actually a younger generation that just, if they answer the phone, will actually believe them and then like follow through. That's a problem. So what we've got on the screen there is this amazing diagram of how we're going to solve that. And really, I want to boil it down. Someone is coming into our portal. Okay, pick your agency. They have George's information. How do we know it's George? Okay, think about that for a minute. How do we know it's George? How do we know it's even a human? What are some of the automated threats right now that you're hearing about? This is across web portals globally, not just government. Anybody have any examples?
He said deep fakes.
Deep
I
fakes,
got my
thank
own
you.
microphone.
Okay.
You took
Yeah,
mine, so.
I got a blower in my ear. Deepfakes, absolutely. What is a deepfake? Well, it's part of what they call synthetic media. It could be a faked video. It could be a faked ID. And the reason I stress that one is, yes, there have been dark web portals appearing that just do nothing but kick out extremely hard to detect fake IDs now. Saw some examples coming up from the state of Florida, and they had one with they're showing it in the UV light, and it shows the holographic image perfectly.
So George brings up a really good point where you bring up several good points. But, you know, if a driver's license picture is just a component of an individual's identity, right? What else is in it a component of an individual's identity that you can use during the verification or the assurance process, right? Like, how does somebody hold their phone? How do they type? Are they moving away from the screen when they really shouldn't? Do you need to go and cut and paste when you're putting in your first name and your last name, right? Probably not, right? But you maybe, yeah? Unless it's a long name, but that's fair, yeah. So, right, so what sort of behavioral analytics can we apply as just a part of an individual's identity component to make sure that the individual with whom your agency is interacting is in fact that individual?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. In fact, with scams, we see shifts in behavior. That's kind of cool. So one of the things we're going to do with identity assurance is if we get into what's called behavioral biometrics, we have a product called BehavioSec, and what it's going to do is a couple things. It's going to evaluate the behavior data and compare it to the last time George was in there. And it can use rules to figure out, okay, there's unusual pauses going on. Maybe there's a Control-C, Control-V going on, copy-paste. Maybe the sensors of the device indicate no motion. Another thing we can look at is, why has this device been sitting on the AC adapter for 3 months? These are all forms of risk. And what we've got actual customers doing right now are counting up that risk. It can be little bits and pieces here and there, but when it totals up, it hits a threshold. And that's where you decide whether we're going to reject it, we're going to step it up, or we're going to accept it. Remember, reject doesn't mean just boot them out. It could just say fraud detected. This is huge.
Right, or additional scrutiny is warranted.
Yes,
right,
especially-
depending on your threshold.
Think about the account details change that would take place. This is where you get into account takeover. That's after a login, when they went into the details of the account, maybe it's a retirement account, they're saying, okay, send my money to this bank's account number. But leading up to that were indications in behavioral data that showed something is not right. It's either deviating significantly from the last session, unusual pauses, or inhuman-like characters blasting through. Maybe the account number was typed out so fast a human couldn't have done that. And the rules would pick up on that, score it. The whole thing would happen right when the user clicks submit. Quarter second later, they call our service is called, quarter second response. The web portal, the user never knows any of this.
Completely seamless.
It's all transparent.
Right, completely seamless behind the scenes to the user. And I think it also, to your point, George, I think that it's important that we have an understanding here, at least an agreement amongst us, is that when we go for identity verification, we were checking the validity of those identity elements. However, you need to make sure that you're putting a layer of risk associated, right? So, right, you look pretty, you're pretty straightforward guy. I mean, you're not sketchy at all. But you know what? So we want to make sure that your identity components belong to you and that they go together. But then also, what do we know about this person, right? How much risk is associated with this person, and how does that factor into our thresholds of whether or not that individual needs to go to remediation, if we need to apply additional scrutiny, or if that person has very low friction, right? Because you can use identity verification and assurance not just to identify where the risk lives, but you can also use it to corroborate the information for the folks that need no friction at all. So you would just pass right through. And and I'm not trying to make a sale. I don't work in sales. I want to go to heaven, so I'm not trying to make a sales pitch, but.
One thing I've noticed, a lot of organizations get stuck on like that key attribute, like, oh, the IP address is everything. Okay, fine. Or the social security number. They have that. Of course, they have that person's information. Yeah, no. So what we're saying is, let's step it up. Let's involve the device. Let's put that around 650 potential attributes tied to just that device, including the device's history. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because we've got interesting challenges with equitable access from a generation that doesn't have credit history and traditional measures. You know, I told my kids, hey, don't do the credit card thing if you don't have to. And they're in the digital payment, so their history is different. But device history now plays a very significant role, especially when individuals show up who are now just turning 18. Again, no credit history, but with device history, we can also see trust history. And this is trust behavior across upwards of above 6,000 organizations contributing to a digital identity network in a fully hashed, what we call tokenized form, privacy insured. And you're able to verify, is this George? What's the trust going on with this tied to this device, and is it George? Couple of use cases. We look at two things that come out of that. Velocity is one, and anomaly is the other one. Velocity is, why is George's device coming into our agency more than 10 times in the last hour? Okay, there's a little bit of risk there. Let's say it goes above 20. We can increase the risk. So what ends up happening is that device is trying over and over again. We eventually age it out and push them into a reject bucket, and that would be a good candidate to get them out of there, because clearly they're up to no good. The other type of velocity is where the same device has been seen across multiple agencies with the same identity trying to do the same thing. We could pick up on that risk. But my favorite one's the anomaly factor, and that's where the same device has now been tied to, say, 500 identities. Let's blow it out of the water. That's extremely high risk. And this is the kind of thing an agency would no longer have to waste their time trying to identity proof what clearly is a high-risk situation. Now, is this fraud? That always comes up. What you're actually talking about is the risk that leads to fraud. I'm married to an attorney. I'm used to the legal definition. Fraud has to be proven. It's always after the fact. An investigation took place. We have the evidence. Here's your fraud. That's not what we're seeing online. That's not what's coming through the door to our portals. What we're seeing is the fraud risk. So when we talk about identity assurance, we're saying we need to reveal that fraud risk, starting with a device. And guess who else is saying this right now? Our buddies over at the Federal Communications Commission. Anybody deal with the FCC? Good, for now.
This session is being recorded. You
Yeah.
should know that.
Just joking. Sorry, Mom. FCC put out a mandate in January. Our team got on board with it. It goes into effect this month. Enforcement starts at the end of the year. What they're now saying is the device takeovers that happen, they called SIM swap. Anybody heard that term before?
Yep.
You heard SIM swap? And the idea is that somebody calls up a carrier like AT&T and says, hey, it's George Freeman, I have all this information. I was on a cruise, my phone fell off the boat. I bought another one on eBay, I borrowed from my brother, it's the usual story. Please help me get my device to my account so I can use my phone again. And of course the carriers are like, oh, we'll gladly help you. Tell us some information about you. And they would ask for things like name, address, last few calls you made, the usual stuff. FCC said enough's enough. You got to stop asking those questions. And furthermore, the call center workflow, don't allow the change. Not during the call. And that's exactly what we're proposing with a solution. We say, look, allow the customer to call in. Clearly they've had an incident, they need help, we're going to help them. But what we're not going to do is allow a critical change like that to take place during that call. That's when the device takeover, the account takeover happens, and it really puts the pressure on the agent in the call center to make that call. You don't want to, think about all the government agencies right now who have a call center. Raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't really know of any that don't have a call center, really, because they're there to help serve the citizens. Think about the same workflow. They're calling up requesting a change. If that's an authorized change, if they convince that individual, they go follow through, and then you've got things like account takeover. What we're saying in the solution to help the FCC really involve the device. Once you have a device in that workflow, two things can happen. First of all, okay, if a device fell off the ship, borrow somebody's device, go to a public library. There's always something available. Once we see that session, we can see the risk. And then we've solved the problem.
Thank you, George. All right, so when we talk about the burden of responsibility for some of these programs, I have a question for you, which is, would it be more helpful or less helpful if you had a line of sight into other agencies' risk associated with individuals? That they knew that, let's say they knew George was a little bit sus, which I did before I asked him to get up, so I apologize, that's on me. But so let's say George was a little bit sus and your agency, Pat, let's say your agency was aware of that. Would it be beneficial to share that risk and keep it out of the silos so that, we all have an understanding that identities, whether it's a person or a business, right, they're organic, they're three-dimensional, they evolve and they change all the time. So if Pat's agency, for example, has better information, more information, different information about that, about George, for example, would that be valuable, and how do you leverage that information? How do you obtain that information? Who houses it? And who owns the burden of responsibility when it comes to identity verification to make sure that that person, as Pat understands it at Pat's agency, has been validated to a level of comfort that you feel comfortable with at your agency, right? What could that look like in the federal government space? That's my question. Would that be valuable? Yes, no? Does anybody say absolutely not? I don't want to hear that. I reject that totally. It would be valuable. Well, thank you, Pat. I appreciate that. So how do we leverage that? How do we leverage interagency intelligence, and perhaps more importantly, right, especially with the advent of login.gov, which is a wonderful solution where we have agencies leveraging a single identity verification site. How do we leverage that information across government entities so that we can raise our confidence level, right, with those individuals and those businesses with whom we interact? What could that look like? Short of having a standard identity infrastructure policy made as a priority, I'm not sure that that's possible. think that's a question, if you have thoughts about that, I'd love to hear about it. Come by and visit at the table. We'll be here tomorrow as well. At the end of the day, like I mentioned, I don't work in sales. At the end of the day, you're going to buy from somebody, right? Just make sure that you're buying a solution that's adaptable, that will evolve, right? We talked about the motive and the opportunity, but we didn't talk about the means on that earlier slide, which is by any means possible. We can go on the dark web. George and I have seen examples. You can get instructions, step-by-step instructions on how to defraud nearly every government agency that's out there with video, step-by-step, and they will ask you after you make your purchase, how did we do? Will you give us 5 stars? Will you rate us so that more people will buy all of our instructions? That's a true story. That actually does happen. So, at the end of the day, have something in place, right? Make sure that you understand the solution shortcomings and their strengths. Make sure that they're adaptable and configurable as your folks, as the fraudsters continue to evolve and change over time. That's all I've got. Any questions? George, you want to come back up in case they have a hard question, a big brain question? Yeah, so the question was about device assessment. So yes, if it's a laptop, if it's a desktop, if it's a phone, a tablet, absolutely. Yep, any of those behaviors can be captured.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Do you want to restate the question?
Question is, how do the different devices play a role with identity? And what we see, first of all, we have technology called LexID Digital. So really, George has one defined for George, and it sees the device George typically uses. And an average user, it'll be somewhere between 3 and 5 devices. One of the things we actually encourage customers to do is build a policy. If they start seeing above that, put in increasing risk weights. So if we start to see 10 devices associated with George, that's starting to get risky. The other nice thing about that is in the case of where FCC has a mandate and you need George to go use another device, if we see that other device, we could immediately see that as trusted because we know it's trusted history. And that would be a relaxed friction workflow. We wouldn't have to throw all that 2-factor and high friction knowledge-based authentication like a lot of agencies do by default because of that trust and what we've seen with the device history. Good question.
Can you see the device that he uses across all of his devices across?
Oh, okay. So the question is, can we see the device across all the different sites we've been to, that kind of thing? The good news there is that think of the service as being a giant condominium with tenants, and every door has a lock. So each organization that is a tenant only sees their data, and it's asymmetrically encrypted, and only they have the keys based on their login to decrypt and see that. We've had that approach from different agencies that say, hey, can you help us with some open case work? And that's very difficult for us to do. And the good news is they can do things like attribute query, look up George, maybe an address associated with it, find out what kind of risk was associated with it. We have a lot of intelligence around email addresses. That's been a big, big thing lately. In fact, we're trying to encourage agencies to use email as the login because we can do a very quick, very rich risk assessment on the email right there. Good question.
Thank you. Did that answer your question? Okay. All right, well, that's it, folks. I mean, if you have any other questions, feel free to come by. George and I will both be at the booth. We appreciate your time. Hope it was useful. Hope it was informative. Thank you very much.